Hey there, my name is Chris Acton with Acton Creative, and this is a Handwoven Experience, episode 127. And in this episode, well, I thought we'd talk about weaving materials. You see, over the past few years, I've done a number of little tiny nuggets all about different weaving materials, and I thought I would bring it all together as a perfect beginner's guide. So if you are just kind of dipping your toe into the weaving world and want a nice foundational video, this is your episode. So let's start at the top, shall we? In weaving, your materials will be broken down into two categories, a warp and a weft. Now, let me just kind of clarify. When you talk about a warp or a weft, that's not a style of material, that is a function of the materials. And here's what I mean. Your warp yarns or warp materials are anything that's going to go through the loom and stay under tension. They need to stay tight. Your weft, on the other hand, is anything that's going to go the opposite direction and more than likely be in a shuttle. So that's what they do in the project. Those are their jobs. And the two things have very different personalities. I like to think of the warp yarns as being very studious, very responsible, very organized, because they have more restrictions, right? They have to go through the loom under tension, and that requires that they have a few more kind of guidelines in place. The weft, however, not so much. It's kind of the party people of the two of them. The weft yarns don't have quite the same restrictions, and therefore can look very different than the warp yarns. So let's dive into each of those. Let's start with the warp. Like I said, anything that you use as a warp needs to be not too stretchy or not too breakable, because it needs to stay under tension. That was part of our description, right? A warp yarn or any kind of fiber, whatever you're using for the warp, has to be able to stay under tension in your project. And that automatically rules out a number of different things, right? It's also good if you don't have something that's too fuzzy, because imagine whatever yarn you use has to travel through the entire loom. So there's a couple different places that it can get snagged on. So you don't want anything that's too fuzzy and glamorous. So that is kind of what you're looking for in a warp yarn. And when you think about fibers for a warp yarn, there's lots of different places you can go, but if you're just starting out, use a cotton. It's just the easiest little gateway fiber to start with, because a cotton is not very expensive. It's certainly not going to break, more than likely not going to break. And it comes in a million colors. It is a great, easy way to just see if you like it. See if this whole weaving thing is for you. Use a cotton for your warp to start. That is my recommendation. Now, are there other fibers available? Of course there are. Wool is beautiful and has that wonderful wool-ish matte. It's really yummy. And of course there's a tencel, which is another great recommendation that's really vivid and has all the colors. There's lots of other options you can go with for a warp. However, if you're just starting, for my 2 cents, go with the cotton. It's a great way to go. Now, as you're starting to look for your actual warp yarn, let's talk about format. Now, if you have had like a past life as some kind of fiber artist or hobbyist, you've been a knitter, a crocheter, you've done rug hooking, I don't know what you've done, something else in the fiber world, you're probably thinking, oh, I got this, that's no problem. And you may even have lots of yarn in your stash already that's in a skein format or a ball format. And these are lovely, don't get me wrong. However, from a weaving perspective, there's not a lot of yardage on either of these formats. And that's a problem, because when you are going to warp your loom, when you're creating the warp for your project, you need a lot of inches. And I mean a lot of inches, because when you're weaving, you don't just need the amount of fiber for the project. You need more, you need plus, you need bonus. You have to have extra inches for each of your warp yarns just because the nature of how you create the fabric, basically. There's always going to be some little waste, some leftovers for your project. So a ball or a skein may not go very far. You'd be surprised how quickly you can go through an entire skein of yarn when you are measuring out the warp for your project. So typically, weavers tend to buy yarn in a different format. Either a tube like this, which comes usually ½ pound, or a cone like this, which pound, ½ pound, depending on who you're buying it from, they can have different sizes, different weights, all that kind of good stuff. So these are the two formats that weavers typically, they kind of lean towards that because you just have a lot more yardage to work with. And especially for a warp, you need a lot of yardage. So that kind of covers our warp yarns and how they function and what you're looking for, right? So let's talk about our friends, the weft yarns. Now, remember I said at the beginning that the weft is kind of the party people? It's so true. Because the weft yarns simply have to go back and forth creating your fabric, right? They are just smashed in between your warp yarns as they go back and forth, right? So they don't have to be unbreakable because you're not going to stretch them. You're not going to pull on them very hard. It's okay if they're fuzzy. It's okay if they have a little stretch depending on your project. Like those restrictions that we had for the warp yarns, none of those are anywhere in sight when it comes to the weft. So that opens up a whole new world for what you can use in your weft, right? You can absolutely go back and use your ball and your skein for the weft. That is no problem at all. And just keep in mind that whatever you use for your warp, you can absolutely use for the weft too. But your weft is a much bigger category. You can use a lot of things for that. As a matter of fact, I always like to encourage trying a little bit of recycled material because honestly, anything that you can cut into a strip, you can use in your weft. So I like recycled neckties or old clothing or whatever you got. You can use pretty much anything in the weft of your project. So how you think about putting together your fabric, you just kind of have to keep in mind those two very different functions and categories. Your warp yarns, very serious, very responsible. And the weft yarns, whatever is going to go in your shuttle, going back and forth the opposite direction, that can be a little of everything. So I hope that gave you kind of a nice foundation as a starting point for how you think about your weaving project and the materials that will go into it, because I know it's a big world and my hope is just that I can help you kind of narrow it down and you can have a clear picture of what you're looking for materials for both of those major elements, the warp and the weft. All right, you guys, if you are just starting on your weaving journey, I am so happy and I cannot wait to see all of the amazing things that you're gonna do. And if you're well on your way, I'm so impressed with you already for getting this far. All right, you guys, weave something, would you? Just give it a try. Have a wonderful week. Happy weaving.